I thought I could handle one crazy night on the Las Vegas Strip. At the time, I was a nursing student in a somewhat rural part of Nevada during my final clinical rotation. The kind where instructors stop holding your hand and start watching closely to see whether you flinch, hesitate, or freeze when something goes wrong. I had been running on caffeine, anxiety, and a permanent low-level sense of being behind for months. My cohort had just completed an especially brutal series of night shifts, the kind that distorts your sense of time so completely that noon feels like midnight and your body no longer trusts clocks or calendars. When Maeve suggested that we take a single night to breathe before the next rotation began, I agreed far too quickly. Maeve had always been better than me at compartmentalizing stress. Not because she felt it less, but because she acknowledged it honestly and then set it down with intention. When she said that one night near the Strip would not undo years of hard work, I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe that I was more than a walking checklist of exams, competencies, and looming evaluations. We checked into a modest hotel just off the Strip, close enough to feel the electricity of Las Vegas humming through the pavement, but far enough away that it still smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air. From the moment the elevator doors opened, I could feel the city working on my nervous system like a stimulant drip. Lights flashed with no regard for circadian rhythm, voices overlapped in constant motion, and I felt the unmistakable sense that rules bent more easily here. The plan was simple, consisting of a walk, a late meal, and a single drink before returning to the hotel early enough that we could still pretend we were the same people who color-coded study guides and obsessed over lab values. I remember thinking as we stepped onto the Strip that the noise felt like standing inside a malfunctioning monitor alarm, persistent and impossible to ignore. I remember Maeve laughing softly beside me, her shoulders finally relaxed, as though the city had given her permission to exhale. The first deviation from the plan was small, involving a street performer who'd collapsed theatrically a few yards ahead of us, drawing a small crowd and a ripple of concern that activated something reflexive inside me before logic could intervene. I moved without thinking, assessing posture and breathing in the way that had been drilled into me, only to realize seconds later that it was an act. The performer sprang upright to applause as my adrenaline surged with nowhere to go. Maeve noticed the tension immediately, placing a steadying hand against my arm, grounding me in a way that reminded me why she was going to be an exceptional nurse. She understood that care was not always about action, but about presence. We laughed it off, moved on, and told ourselves that the city had already taken its one joke at our expense. It had not. Inside the casino where we stopped to eat, the lighting was engineered to erase time entirely. The air was thick with a combination of recycled oxygen and manufactured optimism. While we sat at a small table near the edge of the floor, I became acutely aware of how many people around us looked like they were unraveling quietly. Smiles stretched thin, movements were just slightly delayed, and eyes that carried the unmistakable weight of having stayed too long. I noticed him then, although at the time he registered only as background noise. A man paced near the bar with the restless energy of someone who had lost something and could not decide whether to look for it or blame someone else. He moved in tight, repetitive arcs, checking his phone, scanning the room, and muttering to himself with increasing agitation. While I told myself that I was being overly observant, a bad habit picked up from clinical settings, the tension in my chest refused to ease. Maeve noticed him too. I could tell by the way her posture shifted slightly, her attention narrowing. Without panic, when she suggested that we finish eating and head back sooner than planned, I agreed without hesitation, grateful that she had said what I was thinking. We never made it back to the elevator. As we stood near the exit, the man from The bar suddenly lurched sideways, colliding with another patron, hard enough to send both of them stumbling. In the confusion that followed, I heard the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor with a dull, final thud. Instinct overrode discretion. My feet were already moving before my mind caught up, and when I knelt beside the fallen man, the world narrowed to the familiar geometry of emergency assessment. He was breathing. Shallow and irregular, with a visible contusion forming along his temple. While casino security pushed through the gathering crowd with rehearsed urgency, I found myself issuing quiet instructions, not as a student, but as someone who knew exactly what needed to happen next. I identified myself, stepped back when told, and watched as paramedics took over with professional efficiency. My heart still racing long after they disappeared through a side door. What I did not see, what I would replay endlessly later, was the pacing man slipping away in the opposite direction. His expression tight, with something that looked very much like panic. By the time we reached the hotel room, the adrenaline crash, Pangea set in fully, leaving me shaky and exhausted. My body was left confused by the sudden absence of crisis. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed, shoes kicked aside, and her gaze thoughtful rather than frightened. While we spoke very little, there was an unspoken agreement between us that the night had already exceeded its limit. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and restless, filled with half-formed images of flashing lights and monitors beeping out of sync. When I finally drifted off completely, I had no idea that the worst part of the night was not behind us. I woke to the sound of someone pounding on the door. Not the polite, hesitant knock of housekeeping or the muffled laughter of nearby guests, but a sharp, insistent rhythm that carried urgency and impatience in equal measure. For several disorienting seconds, I could not tell whether it was part of a dream or something real demanding my attention. Maeve was already sitting up, fully awake in a way that told me she had heard it before I had. As I swung my feet to the floor, my body protested violently, my head throbbing with the dull ache of interrupted sleep and residual stress. The knocking intensified, followed by a voice on the other side that was controlled but firm, announcing hotel security and requesting that we open the door immediately. The hallway lights spilled into the room when I complied, illuminating two security officers and a uniformed police officer standing just behind them, their expressions neutral in the practiced way of people who have already decided that this will not be a casual interaction. One of the security officers asked for my name, confirmed it against something on a tablet, and then informed me that I needed to accompany them downstairs to answer a few questions regarding an incident that had occurred earlier in the night. The words themselves were calm, but the implication hit me like a sudden drop in blood pressure. As I glanced back at Maeve, I saw the concern she was trying to mask. Her jaw set in a way that meant she was already calculating outcomes. I told her I would be back shortly, believing it at the time, and followed them into the elevator with the uneasy awareness that the city had decided to collect on a debt I did not remember incurring. In a small, windowless office near the casino floor, I was informed that the man who had collapsed earlier had died at the hospital, and while the cause of death was not yet officially determined, there was a discrepancy in witness accounts that placed me near the incident in a way that warranted further clarification. They were careful with their language, never accusing outright. But the implication was clear enough that my mouth went dry as I replayed every second of the event in my mind. Searching for anything I might have missed or misunderstood, I exclaimed my actions calmly, sticking to objective observations and established protocols, identifying myself clearly as a nursing student and emphasizing that I had stepped back as soon as professionals arrived. The officer listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. And when he asked whether I had interacted with anyone else nearby, my thoughts snagged on the pacing man from the bar, the one who had vanished before security arrived. I mentioned him, describing his behavior and agitation as accurately as I could. And for the first time, I saw a subtle shift in the officer's posture, a flicker of recognition that told me this was not new information. He thanked me, told me they would be in touch, and allowed me to leave with the understanding that I was not to depart the city until further notice. The walk back to the room felt longer than it should have, every step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. When I told Maeve what had happened, she listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than panicked, which somehow made the situation feel both more manageable and more serious at the same time. She asked precise questions, not because she doubted me, but because she understood that clarity would be our greatest asset moving forward. By late morning, rumors had already begun circulating online. The incident reduced to speculative headlines and anonymous comments that twisted fragments of truth into something darker and more sensational. A blurry photo surfaced showing me kneeling beside the fallen man, stripped of context and flooded with assumptions. Despite my attempts to ignore it, the sense of being watched crept in. What escalated everything from stressful to terrifying was the message that arrived on my phone from an unknown number. It contained a single sentence that implied knowledge of my involvement and suggested, without outright threat, that silence would be in my best interest. My hands shook as I showed it to Maeve. I saw in her eyes the same conclusion forming that had already taken root in my own mind. The Payson man had not disappeared by accident. I still don't know how he got my number, but he had been watching, calculating, and now, for reasons I did not yet understand, he had decided that I was a liability. The rest of the day unfolded in a haze of cautious movements and controlled breathing. Maeve insisted that we screenshot messages and avoid being alone in public spaces. She contacted a family friend who worked in healthcare administration, seeking advice without overexposure, while I replayed the night repeatedly. The small details started taking on new significance with every passing minute. By evening, another message arrived. This one was more direct, referencing the incident with unsettling specificity and suggesting that the truth had a way of disappearing if handled correctly. There was still no explicit threat, but the implication was clear enough that my chest tightened painfully. The realization settled in that this was no longer just about a tragic accident or a misunderstood moment. It was about someone who had made a decision. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that my training and instinct to help had placed me directly in the path of someone who had everything to lose. As the neon lights outside the window flickered to life once again, bathing the room in artificial color, I realized with a sinking certainty that the night we thought had ended was still very much in progress. Whatever came next would test not only my resolve as a future nurse, but my ability to stand my ground when doing the right thing came at a personal cost. By the third day in Las Vegas, I felt as though my nervous system had forgotten how to stand down, every sound registering as potential escalation and every unfamiliar face feeling like a possible continuation of the same threat that had begun quietly and now seemed determined to press closer without ever fully revealing itself. Maeve. And I moved through the city carefully. Not in the dramatic way people imagine when they think of danger, but in the subtle, exhausting way that comes from constant vigilance. Choosing routes with intention, and never allowing ourselves to be distracted for more than a few seconds at a time. The Strip, which had once felt surreal and electric, now felt predatory in its excess. The sheer number of people provided cover for anyone who wanted to disappear into movement and noise. The messages continued. Irregular but persistent, each one crafted carefully enough to avoid explicit threats while still conveying an unsettling degree of familiarity with my schedule, my location, and the ongoing investigation. They referenced details that had not been made public, details that only someone directly involved would know. They implied that this person had access to information far beyond what I had initially assumed began to weigh heavily on me. What made it worse was the waiting. The police investigation moved at a pace that felt glacial compared to the speed at which my anxiety accelerated. While I understood intellectually that procedures existed for a reason, emotionally, it felt like standing still in the path of an oncoming vehicle, hoping it would slow down in time. I was asked to provide additional statements, clarify timelines, and identify photographs, all of which I did carefully and methodically. Drawing on the same clinical detachment I used during simulations, even as my sleep fractured further, and my appetite disappeared entirely. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, not in the form of an arrest or a dramatic confrontation, but through a detail I had almost dismissed entirely. During one of my follow-up interviews, an officer mentioned casually that the pacing man had been identified as a freelance event promoter who frequently worked temporary gigs near the Strip. He often got paid in cash, and his employment history was fragmented enough to make him difficult to track consistently. What caught my attention was the mention of a prior incident involving a guest who had suffered a fall under suspicious circumstances. The incident had never fully resolved due to lack of cooperative witnesses. The pieces clicked together slowly. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a grim alignment of probabilities. This man had not been panicking because of an accident. He had been panicking because something he had orchestrated had gone wrong. My presence, my training, and my insistence on staying with the fallen man had introduced variables he could not control. The messages stopped abruptly that night, replaced by a silence that was somehow more unnerving than the threats themselves. Maeve and I both understood instinctively that this was not relief, but recalibration. Someone who had relied on pressure had shifted strategies, and the absence of noise felt like the held breath before a deeper move. I spent that evening reviewing everything I could remember about the man, his posture, his movements, the way his attention had snapped toward the fallen guest with something like alarm rather than concern. I wrote it all down, not trusting my memory to hold under stress, and sent the documents securely to the detective assigned to the case. Knowing that the smallest detail could tip the balance, sleep came late and shallow once again. When I finally drifted off, it was with the unsettling awareness that the city outside had not changed, only my perception of it had, and that the next escalation would likely come not with noise, but with consequence. The call came early the next morning, cutting through my half-sleep with a clarity that jolted me fully awake before I even processed the words being spoken. The pacing man had been taken into custody overnight after attempting to leave the state using falsified identification. While the investigation was still ongoing, evidence recovered from his belongings suggested a pattern of behavior that extended well beyond a single incident. Surveillance footage, financial records, and digital communications painted a picture of someone who had been manipulating vulnerably intoxicated tourists into risky situations for personal gain, skirting legality just closely enough to avoid sustained scrutiny until now. The fallen man's death, it turned out, had been the result of a compounded medical event triggered by stress and injury, not by any intervention I had made. While that knowledge brought relief, it also came with a heavy sense of responsibility. If I had hesitated that night, if I had chosen not to act because it was inconvenient or uncomfortable, the outcome might have been far worse, not only for that individual, but for others who would have crossed this man's path later. The messages never resumed. Instead, I received a formal notice clearing me of any wrongdoing, followed by a request to provide one final statement for the record. It was something I completed carefully, aware that this experience would now follow me throughout my career. not as a blemish, but as a reminder of the weight that comes with being trained to respond when others look away. Maeve and I left Las Vegas quietly, without celebration or closure in the dramatic sense. The city receded behind us as though it had never happened at all. The Strip returned to being just lights and architecture, stripped of its menace now. That the threat had been named and contained, and yet I knew that it would always occupy a specific place in my memory, not as a vacation, but as a threshold. Back home, life resumed its familiar rhythms: lectures, rotations, exams, and evaluations filling the days with structured demands that felt almost comforting in their predictability. I returned to clinical settings with a renewed seriousness, not hardened, but sharpened. I was acutely aware of how quickly ordinary moments could pivot into emergencies, and how important it was to trust both training and instinct. Maeve and I talked about that night less and less as time passed. Not because it faded, but because it had already integrated itself into who we were becoming. It surfaced occasionally, in quieter moments, not as fear, but as a shared understanding that doing the right thing often comes with invisible costs, and that courage is rarely loud or cinematica. Satisfaction came later, in subtle ways. It came in the knowledge that the investigation had uncovered additional victims who were now able to come forward. In the confirmation that the system, slow and imperfect as it was, could still work when people refused to back down, and in the quiet confidence that I had faced something deeply unsettling and emerged intact. That crazy night as a nursing student had not broken me. It had clarified me. And as I moved forward, into a profession built on responsibility, accountability, and care, I carried with me the certainty that even in the brightest, loudest places, integrity still mattered. And that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stay, even when everything around you tells you to walk away. Clinical rotations resumed without ceremony. Instructors evaluated competencies with the same detached precision as before, and patients arrived with their needs and histories. I found myself hyper-aware of details I might once have overlooked. Subtle shifts in behavior, the way stress manifested physically, long before it became verbalized. And how often danger announced itself not with chaos, but with discomfort that people preferred to ignore. Maeve noticed the change immediately. She never framed it as concern, only curiosity. Asking thoughtful questions in the way she always did, encouraging reflection without forcing it. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that processing an experience like that was not about reliving it endlessly, but about integrating it honestly, allowing it to reshape judgment without distorting compassion. The formal follow-up from Las Vegas arrived weeks later, confirming what we already knew. The investigation had expanded significantly and additional evidence had come to light. The man who had tried to intimidate me now faced consequences far beyond what he had likely anticipated, when he chose to rely on fear instead of silence. Reading the report did not bring a surge of triumph or vindication, but rather a grounded sense of closure, the kind that settles slowly and allows you to finally unclench muscles you did not realize had been tense for months. What stayed with me most, however, was not the threat itself, but the realization of how thin the line was between being a bystander and being involved, and how easily that line disappeared the moment someone needed help. In lectures about ethics and patient advocacy, I found myself paying closer attention. Not because the material was new, but because it now carried weight beyond hypotheticals, anchored by lived experience rather than theory. Maeve and I never framed what happened as something heroic, because that kind of language felt dishonest. It minimized the fear and complexity of the situation. Instead, we talked about responsibility. about what it meant to carry training into the real world, and about the reality that doing the right thing rarely felt clean or cinematic while it was happening. It felt messy, inconvenient, and occasionally isolating, and yet it was still necessary. As graduation approached, the memory of that night began to take on a different shape. Less sharp, more instructive, like a scar that no longer hurt, but still informed movement. I realized that I no longer wished the night had never happened, because without it, I might still believe that preparation alone was enough, and that risk could always be managed from a safe distance. Las Vegas had taken those illusions and stripped them away with fluorescent honesty, and in their place, it had left something far more durable. The true satisfaction of that night did not arrive with headlines, arrests, or official statements, but quietly, over time, in moments so ordinary they might have been missed entirely. If I had not learned to pay attention, it arrived the first time a patient trusted me enough to tell the truth about something they had been hiding out of fear. Recognizing in my steadiness the absence of judgment, it arrived when I advocated firmly for someone whose concerns were being dismissed as inconvenient. Hearing my own voice remain calm and unyielding in a way it might not have been before. It arrived in the understanding that integrity was not a personality trait, but a series of decisions made repeatedly, especially when no one was watching. Maeve graduated beside me, steady as ever. When we crossed that stage, there was no spoken acknowledgement of what we had shared in Las Vegas, no nod or smile exchanged for the crowd to interpret. The moment belonged to the future, not the past, and yet the past stood quietly behind it, shaping the way we stepped forward. The Las Vegas Strip continues to glow every night. Indifferent to the stories that unfold beneath its lights, somewhere out there, people are still making decisions they will regret by morning. I no longer feel the pull to be part of that world, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Knowing exactly where my responsibility begins and ends. That crazy night as a nursing student did not make me fearless. It made me steady. And in a profession where steadiness can mean the difference between chaos and care, between silence and accountability, that may be the most valuable lesson I could have learned. Even if it arrived under neon lights, at the edge of exhaustion, in a city that never intended to teach me anything at all,